An economy needs stability in order to function. A government needs to plan and invest into infrastructure for the present, but also for the future. When an economy is stagnant, investments begin to dry up. Today, when we look at the US economy, we see pockets of good and bad. The financial portion is deceased and is a rotting carcass. The manufacturing sector is a museum, artifacts of what once was. The question is, how can the US grow themselves out of this deflationary spiral? You came here for the truth, so let me unveil that for you. Today we will talk about the Fed's own data showing the US economy has had no growth in 2016 so far. And this shouldn't surprise anybody. I'll get into that in a moment, but first I want to talk about the trade deficit. This article is out of Bloomberg and it talks about the America's trade deficit, which widened in February to a 6-month high as an increase in imports exceeded a more modest pickup in shipments overseas. What I'll talk about in a moment is basically the fact that they have noticed this uptick, which is basically the first in 5 months, and their actual amount of shipments overseas. But we're talking about such minimal amounts. First of all, the gap increased 2.6% to 47 billion, and apparently that was revised. And the gap always continues to get worse and worse. That's always what happens. The gain in exports was just the first in 5 months and highlights the squeeze on American manufacturers from a stronger dollar that's made US-made goods less attractive in a weaker global marketplace. So you will see that countries will weaken their currencies in order to be more attractive for exports. One example historically was Mexico. When we had the peso crisis, you saw Mexico devalue their currency in order to stay competitive and to be using basically weakening themselves in such a way, but doing so at the same time really expanding on their exports. That's the goal anyway. And then you look more recently where we had Switzerland doing a similar activity where they pegged their currency to the euro, and I believe it was at 120, and essentially said, look, we can't handle all this influx. People are buying francs like crazy, and this is unfortunately making our currency strong. So at the same time, they purposely made it weaker. It's really crazy to see how they do this business. Let's move on here to this article out of CNBC. It may turn out that the economy did not grow at all in the first quarter. Trade data released Tuesday showed that the deficit widened more than expected to 47 billion. And it was a bigger drag on growth than expected. Oh, sure it was. I mean, this is some BS. Let's keep it at that. It's the latest economic metric that's chiseled away at the tracking model for the first quarter growth. How many times have you heard me say that there will be no growth, that these GDP now statistics, which I'll show you in a second, will be revised downward and downward? I've covered it multiple times. The median of economists who participate in the survey is 0.5% for tracking the GDP growth, down from 0.9% in 1 week. And, they use all these models and metrics, and ultimately it doesn't mean too much, but it's interesting to cover. It's interesting to look at. Because when you look at the underlying fundamentals, they're weak. They're way off. I mean, you have an entire stock market controlled by a bunch of computer programs. It's like I'm living in the future, but it's here today, and it's not pretty. Essentially, what they said is that this 0.5% can easily turn into a negative number or a much higher number. They don't know at this time. And we know that these numbers are false to begin with. So I've shown you the GDP now before. This is right from their website. As you look at the Atlanta Fed GDP now forecast in the bottom right-hand corner, dipping below 0.5%. And they had these consensus that take place trying to get all of these analysts together. And they basically say, what they believe the economy will do. and this goes for any stock. They have analysts who predict stocks and everything, but they're never accurate. In fact, they're mostly wrong. So you can usually take the opposite bet and have a more accurate display of what will happen. All I wanted to say was that I told you here that it doesn't take fancy models and everything else to depict what will happen in the future. Look at the basic, essential fundamentals and you'll have a pretty good picture. Yes, they can get the stock market to rise up. I do believe that the stock market is worth less than it was some time ago, but in terms of its actual dollar amount, it's higher than it was in 2009. So what does that mean? Well, the fact is that we have a devalued currency, which makes it look better. If you want a very good example of this, look at what happened in the Asia crisis in the 90s. Look at what happened with Mexico as well. There's other countries as well that, sure, their currency gets devalued significantly and the stock market can rise like crazy. Venezuela is another example. But of course, nobody has to believe that. There's always individuals who ignore it. Anyway, Reuters, I won't play the video, but essentially China slashes top banker salaries by 50%. They're pretty serious about this kind of things here. And why would they do this? Well, we never know what's going on the inside. But what I would like to say is that when they're having hard times, they're willing to really step over the line, step over the boundaries, and try to make things happen. They prefer public works projects to the quantitative easing models, although they are into that as well. But they do prefer the public works projects. And I'm not a fan of either, but I would definitely rather vote for the public works. At least something's getting done. Even there's empty cities, that's a heck of a lot better than just printing money and giving it to banks. This is from my book, and it talked about a similar activity. And this is from 1920. As we look at the depression of 1920 that most people don't know about, and what I'll get to is that they solved the problem of this crisis by cutting costs and expenditures of the government. Never been done in the recent past, but this is a perfect example of the US. And as many economists and scholars would like to ignore, that's right, the economy began its upward trend in 1921. So in 1920, they have a crisis. 1921, they're back up and running. All without the massive bailout packages and other means of government intervention, the government slashed the budget tremendously. Federal spending was reduced by 65% in a single year, which is a substantial decrease. And yet you hear today all of these people saying that if you were to actually slash federal spending by 65%, that it would cause chaos and nuclear bombs would be dropped and Russia and China would be the new global superpower and all this business. Look at how bad the economy has been since, let's say, 2008, 2007, even, 2009. The stock market's low. And yet, here we are today, coming on like a decade later. The economy is still terrible. But if we use this as an example of just over a year where the economy would have been hurt very badly and back up and running, I would take that. Because people can just, really deal with it for that year and then you'll be back up and running. I think that's smarter to do, but ultimately it's not political. And I'm not suggesting that they do this now. It's not going to happen. But I'm just saying you can't continue to increase expenditures and expect it to be anything but negative. This is just another company here, Fiat Chrysler, laying off 1,300 workers indefinitely, ending one of the 2 shifts in Michigan. And of course, when you look at it, this is a business that doesn't seem to be on the up at all in North America, or I should say just the US and Canada. Some of those jobs have been shipped to Mexico, others to Brazil and to China. And ultimately, the whole game of bringing your profits overseas have definitely increased. This is just two articles that I just wanted to cover quickly here. Saudi Arabia has outlined plans to ramp up its austerity program and avert the threat of national bankruptcy amid a sliding oil price and a growing tensions with its regional oil exporting rival, Iran. Now, I mean, this is silly. You have to see this. This would be on top of the austerity program unveiled last year. The extra revenue, according to officials, would come from measures such as a value-added tax, a tax on expats, and a tax on sugary drinks. This is absolutely ridiculous. I can't even believe you're going to just add taxes, and that's going to make you money somehow, and then putting a tax on sugary drinks. What's going on here? This is ridiculous. The Spanish Prime Minister has announced moves to cut the working day by 2 hours and bring an end to the traditional siesta in an attempt to bring the country into line with its European counterparts. This is interesting what they're doing here, going ahead and trying to end the siesta. Whether or not that's beneficial, I don't know. I thought it would be interesting just to bring it out here. They're trying to change a lot of the rules. I don't know if the people of Spain like the siesta generally, but it seems that it's something that is part of their tradition. So whether they want to change that or not, I think if the people don't want to change it, then they shouldn't change it. It needs to be decided by the people, but of course the laws are not decided by the people anymore. It's simply the oligarchy, the technocratic elite, or the ruling elite, or whatever name you want to use. They're the ones making the decisions. If you found this video informative, please give me a thumbs up. Every time you give me a thumbs up, which is something that I look at regularly, I see those thumbs up and it tells me that you like these videos, you want to see more of them, and it also helps to push these videos higher up in the YouTube search ranking. So if someone is searching, for example, US trade deficit or US GDP, there's a better chance of my video coming up here if everyone basically gives me a thumbs up. So I really do appreciate that when you do so. Last but not least, if you found this video informative, I know you will find my book, The Money GPS, even more informative. You can look through the book. If you go over to Amazon, they have a look inside feature, which will allow you to flip through the pages of the book and see if you like it. Take care.